Let me ask you this question about language in general. As I said, I was in Asia last week. I think it's so fascinating how we use the same times, the same calendars, but we don't use the same language. This is a non-entertainment. This is nothing. I'm just interested. Do you think we will ever get to the point in this world where we have one language?
I hope not.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I hope not.
But do you think we will?
I think there's an outside chance that, it might happen. It's a question of, will it happen before the entire world is destroyed?
Right.
Or before we create some sort of technology where we don't need to all have the same language and can still communicate very easily.
Well, I met a nice Russian couple, and we were translating via Google Translate. So, it might be that before you know it.
I've done the same thing. Like, I studied Hindi when I was going to India, but then I was on the plane and I was trying to help somebody. We had internet. She didn't know how to fill out her
immigration
declaration form. And so it was like, I was going through and I was going pretty well. But then it's like we got to this one because I was basically using Google Translate to translate English into Hindi.
Right.
And then we got to one word, signature. So I put it in there, and she looks at it because she's reading off my screen. She's like, no.
Makes no sense.
And so I'm like, sign. And she's like, no. And I'm like, oh, Jesus. I think I tried to go to Spanish, and I put firmar, see if that would just get me at something better. And she's like, no. Finally, somebody comes over and is looking at what we're doing, because this is an older lady, and I think she said, oh, apkinam, and it was like, oh yeah, your name. I was like, oh yeah, why didn't I think of this name? Right. And then she finally does it and completes her card. Anyway,
why do you not want it to become one language? Do you like the beauty of the difference?
That's the entire thing, man. Like, that's why I study languages. It's amazing. It's amazing. I grew up with English and Spanish, and I honestly always thought of Spanish as an annoyance because I didn't speak it as well as my relatives.
Right. And
they would speak too fast, and I couldn't understand what they were saying all the time, and I couldn't express myself the way they could. And so, as a kid, because I wasn't, super, super fluent, it was just like an annoyance to me, a hindrance,
right,
an impediment. But once I started actually studying other languages, because I was fascinated, I go back to Spanish, and I'm looking like, wait a minute, there's all of this cool stuff that's happening. And, of course, the more and more knowledge I gain, the more appreciation I gain for Spanish, and also English and weird things that are done in English that you never think about from, like, a second language perspective.
Right.
And the same is true of every single language. I don't care how closely related they are. There's always going to be something that a language does that's really, really weird and interesting. Yeah. And, of course, all of this comes about the same way. Right? Because it's humans trying to solve the problem of how can I indicate to that person what I'm feeling and thinking.
Yeah.
And so, and we're all like the same basic makeup, all got the same brains and stuff, but there are all these different strategies, different solutions that we've used.
Yeah.
And some of them seem so out there until you think of it from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And it's just lost ingenuity.
Right.
It's kind of like, it's the same type of thing where you say like, well, what if one country they just produced all films from now on?
Right.
And it's like,
you'd miss out on all that stuff that they offer.
It might make things easier from like a utilitarian perspective. But the thing is, people have an easy time understanding this with art. Art is not utilitarian.
Right.
It's kind of like say, well, okay, the Beatles are the best band. Why don't we just have their music? Why don't we just have them do all songs? Why don't we reincarnate them and keep having Beatles music? It's like, just because the Beatles are a great band and just because you love the Beatles doesn't mean that's all you're going to listen to.
Right.
Like, talk to the musicians themselves. Like, unless it's Oasis, you say, do you only listen to your own music? Like, no.
That's a great comparison. It's fair.
Right. And so it's
Makes
like,
sense.
When people think of language in a purely utilitarian sense, it's obvious to ask these questions like, well, why don't we all just speak one language?
Right.
Like, what's the point of having all of these languages? It's like, but language is not utilitarian.
Right.
And it wouldn't be purely, we don't even use it in a utilitarian sense. If we did, there would never be such a thing as poetry.
Right.
Like, why would it ever exist? And so when we go about creating it, it's obviously not a single person doing it. When you're talking about natural languages, it's the collective consciousness of unconscious creation throughout the march of time. But what you end up seeing are these interesting, fascinating little innovations. And you can't
slang and stuff.
Yeah, and it's like slang and also grammatical patterns. And you can't say like, well, one person did this, maybe not even one region, but you get a general sense, or not even like at a single time, but it's like these people who spoke this language at that time innovated this strategy. And maybe we don't see it exactly the same way in any other language. Maybe it's totally unique. Maybe it's similar to this other language that is really, really different, but evolved a very similar strategy for different reasons.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you lose the languages, you lose that stuff.
Yeah.
You lose that ingenuity.
That's a great
And you
answer.
can appreciate it artistically.
Yeah.
It's just that a lot of people don't think of it because of the utilitarian nature
Right.
of language.
In that vein, what is your thoughts on emojis? And do you consider them a language?
They're not a language; they're an orthography.
Oh, fair point.
Yeah, just like hieroglyphs.
Right.
But what's interesting with any orthography is that it develops a life of its own.
Yeah.
Of course, because there are things that you do in writing that you don't do in speech.
Right.
And vice versa, of course. Like, we're terrible at being able to encode intonation, which is why there are so many text message and email problems where
Right.
it's like somebody sends a message, the other person's like, wow, this person's pissed off. And it's
Right.
like,
No, I said
if
that
you
in
had heard the
joking.
way I meant to say it. But yeah, we don't have that in there.